Welcome to Word on the Cloud, where we talk about what was, what is, and what could be. My name's Aiko. I'm your host. Hey. I'm gonna be honest, every time I get on the mic, I feel like my voice gets quieter, and I just think, everyone's looking at me. But I hope you've been having a good week. This week has been pretty chill for me. Hung out with some friends, got in and out an ungodly amount of times. I have a driving lesson scheduled for next week. Feeling confident. Got sweet words of encouragement from a few, and it's made me feel better. So thank you. Let me know how your week's going because I'd love to hear about it. But for now, on to the podcast. So I love Dragon Ball Z, if that wasn't apparent. I just recently finished my first watch through of the Dragon Ball Z series in Japanese, which I 1,000% recommend. It's become hands down my favorite anime, and for a few reasons. It's beautiful, it's very well written, creative, but it's mostly my favorite because each character, even if they're there for a brief moment, they have an impact. Whether that's something major to the storyline or something minor that just means something. Anything, to you. For example, I love the Ginyu frog. Not going to spoil anything, but if you've seen it, you know that he pops up every now and again, and it's silly and makes me laugh. But for the bigger moments, I was able to see their impact in a different way. The way that the character basically changed the outcome of the situation that they were in by changing their perspective and acknowledging themselves and others. They recognize their impact in these moments. I recommend the Japanese version of Dragon Ball Z because I feel like the voice actors were able to emote so well in their voice that it really made each character the type of fighter that you wanted them to be, or the type of person in general. For example, Krillin comes across as someone who knows his limits, but that doesn't stop him sometimes from fighting anyways. And he's very loyal. Goku, he's silly, but that contributes to how he's able to make things light when the universe is literally in danger, and he's always looking to challenge himself. I could go on, breaking every character down, and love them all, but this episode is centered around my personal favorite character, which for a minute was back and forth between him and Piccolo, but I finally came to terms that my favorite is in fact Vegeta. Vegeta. I love him. The proud Saiyan prince. Ever since he showed up with his red hair, pride and ego were obvious traits that he had. The negative aspects, which there are positives to pride and ego, believe it or not. I didn't. But he obviously was being ruled by the dark side. Over time, a lot of time, these traits were ones that were still within him and would come out occasionally. But overall, he overcame the negative of these and became someone much more. He went from ruthless Saiyan prince destroying planets to someone who helps save the universe, and he went from bad man to family man. I hate me sometimes. Look at my writing and I'm like, yeah, you wrote that. But in the end, overall, he recognized that him wanting to be superior and letting himself get full of himself really held him back from being the strongest, surpassing Son Goku, which was his goal for a minute. The reason Goku surpassed him was because Goku never had a goal of being the one, the only one. He kept challenging himself. He didn't try to kill the villain. Instead, he basically said, I'm going to face you now, but I want this fight to make us stronger, so that way we can fight again at an even better level. And that's why he became the strongest. I wanted to talk about how we can let our ego and our pride get in the way, and why we need to take a Genki Dama to the negative aspects of those, because I think it would be a tall order to say, get rid of these things, and it would be an even taller order to just do that. So I always like to look into the definition of a word. I think that offers a good place to start, because it's a very simple way of understanding a word. But for this one, I found the Psychoanalysis Definition of Ego a little more interesting. And it says that It's the part of the mind that mediates between the conscious and the unconscious, and is responsible for reality testing, which is the objective evaluation of an emotion or thought against real life. An ego is also responsible for our sense of self. The dictionary definition for ego is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. So basically what you think of yourself. But in the first definition, we can begin to understand how that simple of a start can go in very different directions. Pride is a feeling of deep satisfaction from one's own achievements, the achievements of those they are close with, and it's also a consciousness of one's own dignity, how much respect you're worthy of. So we can see where these can take a negative turn. A healthy ego is a loving one. It allows us to appreciate ourselves and accept ourselves because we have that confidence. And that can turn into being able to face some challenging things. And since we have faith in ourselves and our abilities, we also carry that over to others, and we have confidence in what they can do. When we have an unhealthy ego, we think we're superior and will compete or manipulate in efforts to make that true. Also, strangely, we need validation and tend to be insecure when we feel like any aspect of us is being mocked or challenged. I would notice in Dragon Ball Z that characters who had their egos enter the room before they did, Frieza, they didn't like to feel inferior or like they were being made a fool of, and that in turn would make them become angry and lash out. Anger is ego, and that can make the result for you an unfavorable one. With pride, healthy pride is one that you have a positive notion of self-worth based on your efforts and accomplishments. One thing I loved about Vegeta was that he did have a lot of Saiyan pride. He always made it a point to say that Saiyans were the strongest warriors and never back down. He went back to Planet Vegeta with no questions, even though Broly's unhinged self was there, so he had a lot of confidence and love for being a Saiyan. With an unhealthy pride, there's an arrogance to it. It's being selfish, refusing to ask for help, whether it's for yourself and or others. It's a very self-centered state to be in. And when these two mingle, pride and ego, if they're not in the best of places, then that's an imbalance with reality. With ego, we have this inflated sense of self-worth. Yet with pride, we devalue others and build ourselves up when we feel inadequate. So already those two are contradicting. And this was part of the reason I find the psychoanalysis of ego interesting, because it mentioned reality testing, where you basically try to put these emotions and thoughts to the test with reality. And if they're already in disarray in our inner world, then our whole concept of reality is pretty much screwed. I didn't know how else to say it, but it's not going to be a genuinely favorable place. I personally don't like arrogance. It's one of those traits that's hard to work with. And I think it's because reality, in a way, is skewed for the person who displays that type of behavior. For me, personal example, would be when someone doesn't like you. And I mean for a reason that would only make sense to them, And their perception of a situation or a view is based on how their world works and how they compare you to themselves. Because pride and ego, in the very negative aspects, are very self-involved. I've had this happen where the other person was trying to build a castle in some quicksand, and since their reality didn't match up with what was actually happening, they stayed in a very limiting space that didn't allow them to flourish in the way they could. And if they were aware of the true reality of things, that may have been a tough pill to swallow, but it would have allowed for a lesson and some growth, and possibly more. I knew a very talented artist who had expressed that they were creating works that didn't really resonate with them, but those types of things got more attention on social media. I didn't much care for it either, so I never really liked the post that they said they didn't like creating. I took that word on it. Now, that's the only type of style that they create. Really, so much so that they actually said they will not create in a certain style. Will not. Will. There's importance to the words that we use. There's words with words that need to be said. Now, in my opinion, the artist devalued the work and is now limiting themselves. Even more so because if we're not exercising a certain talent, that may start to fade. And now we're going backwards. But because of pride and because of ego, we're willing to do that just to prove whatever point. So, what do? I always have something to recommend. No? It's cool to know a lot of the work here is mental. It was funny because looking up how to create a healthy ego, the first step that pops up is realizing the world doesn't revolve around you, which sounds kind of silly because I always say it ironically, but there is truth to it. Since an unhealthy ego is one that is very self-centered, it's important to remember that there are other people and a world out there, and you're not the only one who is just trying to get through each day. There are others out there who need and want just as much as you do. It's important to recognize that you're going to be the one who needs to wait on you and take care of you. But that's simple enough to think, right? If we can change our perspective in certain aspects, then pride and ego won't even be things that are thought about. For the most part, I think we can remain in a neutral, relaxed state, where when these things come up, it's few and far between. Of course, discussing them thoroughly and thoughtfully can get us closer to that. So the next tip I have for you is to acknowledge your insecurities and don't use them to defend yourself. That sounds difficult because insecurities can very well affect our abilities, but when we're using them as a defense, then we just hold ourselves in that space without any room for growth. And that's what this is about. We all have insecurities. They're really only ever going to affect you, if you allow them to. You have to live with them until you've come to peace with it. If we don't, then our ego will suffer, because then we think low of ourselves. Our pride will suffer in the way that will bring others down just for the sake of feeling better about ourselves. And even that's not really feeling better, because that's typically driven by low self-worth. So address parts where you feel could be better, and take the necessary steps to get there. You really will if you try. My third tip: distance yourself from your ego. Distance yourself from your thoughts and emotions. And that doesn't mean to just drop it all, no thoughts, head empty. But it means to recognize that you are not these things. You feel your emotions, but detach is different. When I used to be sad, I would do things based on that sadness, whether it was shopping or just getting away for a bit. And they weren't always the healthiest of choices, but I identified myself with this sadness and held myself in a space that just allowed that feeling to basically just hang around. To make it so normal to who I was attracted just more of that, because that's the signal, like the bad signal. It was the sad signal. Allow yourself to be aware of these emotions and thoughts, but question them and challenge them. And if it resonates with you truly, then that's all it needs to be. There's no need to make it a part of you. I feel like, especially lately, people are attaching too much to their thoughts and emotions, and their idea of who they are and who they want to be. I missed a period of time where there was that post going around that said labels are for soup cans, and I always hated describing myself anyways. I feel like it's just easier to act how you're going to act, based on whatever has made you that way to that point, and adjust accordingly based on the reaction you get, whether or not you like it, and let others confirm that you're giving the energy you want to put out there. I hope that makes sense. My fourth tip is one that I saw come up a couple times for building a healthy pride and ego, and that is listen more than you talk. I feel like when I've just let people talk, that they do tend to talk a lot about themselves and give quite a bit of information, which isn't necessarily terrible, depending on how it's said in the context. But when it's a talk driven by your ego or pride, often people may resent someone who talks in that way. When we listen to others, there's a chance that we may hear something we haven't heard before. There's a quote by the Dalai Lama that said, "When you talk, you are only repeating what you already know. But if you listen, you may learn something new," which I thought was a nice way to put a bow on this piece of advice. The fifth tip is to open your mind and ask the right questions. When we come from a place where we think we know it all and have all the answers, we close ourselves off to the endless amount of possibilities that could be out there, could be offered by another. If you have an open mind, that offers the opportunity for bigger and better things to come in, or not, depending on what you're open to, but be open to trying to understand another perspective or idea. And you can ask what questions you need to make sure that it will actually work for you. But by knowing a side other than your own, that can be used to your advantage, so you can make a well-informed choice and be flexible. What's the quote? The one constant in life is change, which has been a funny saying to me because I see what they did there. But it's true. Change is going to happen, whether or not you do. And being open to that doesn't mean that you're knocking yourself. In fact, you're actually helping build yourself up because you're open and adaptable. And the last tip I'll leave you guys with is knowing that you have all the power you need to make yourself into the best version of you. And I don't mean best as in you're perfect and no more work is needed, but in the way that you keep going after what you love, what you want, and understand that it takes you and others to really make things as fulfilling and as challenging as they can be. And you can come out of those challenges stronger each time. There's no limit, but you will limit yourself if you allow it. You know what I'm saying? But do with this information what you will. I do want to thank you for sharing your time and energy with me. And I'll talk to you again soon. Later.